Lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. We're here to discuss intelligence and espionage and spies and spy agencies and all that entails. Trotsky said that the flaws and qualities of a society were displayed in their army with an extraordinary and exceptional intensity. And that's even more true of an intelligence service and of the organs of espionage. And we've got an amazing panel here of intelligence experts who are going to have a sort of wide expertise, China and Britain, America and the Middle East, the ex-Soviet Union, and Israel and the Middle East as well. So I think without any more talking, we're going to just hit the road and start talking about each of those in turn. But first of all, let me introduce to everyone. We've got, to my left is Gordon Corera, BBC intelligence and security correspondent, analyst, and one of the stars of the podcast, The Rest is Classified. Next to him is David McCloskey, who's flying over from Texas, ex-CIA analyst, expert, a brilliant thrillerist, which is a word I devise to describe him, in fact, who is the author of Damascus Station and a series of amazing novels that have made him really our top spy novelist at the moment, I think. And the latest one is The Persian, which isn't, I'm just saying that to torment you, because it's not for sale yet. It's not out yet, is it?
It's not out here. I actually think the bookshop has some.
Oh, good. Well, there we are. But the latest one is the official latest one is The Seventh Floor, which is brilliant. We've got Andrei Soldatov, whose book, who's an expert on the Russia, FSB, Ukraine, and whose book, The New Nobility, about the new ruling class of Putinist Russia, was really a seminal work that everyone should read, and has lately written a memoir, which is in front of him. And then we have Jake Simons, former Jewish Chronicle editor, expert on Israeli espionage, and most recently the author of Never Again, and Israelphobia. So amazing lineup. So what we're going to do is think of questions, because the questions are endless. We're going to come to those early on. And what I want to do is to go through each of them and ask them, in this intelligence organ of their expertise, what is an operation recently that particularly captures the flaws and qualities of the agency in question? So I'm going to start with David, with the CIA, which is going through a very, very strange time. How good is it, and how bad is it at the moment, and what is an operation that has really worked recently?
Yeah. Well, the CIA is great, Simon. Come on. Yeah. The operation, I think that for me, captures, I think some of the spirit of the agency, but also, which I think really an evergreen topic in intelligence, is this dance between the sort of human side of the business and the technical side of the business. And there's a Swiss cryptology firm called Crypto AG that was founded in the late 1940s by a guy named Boris Hagelin. And Boris Hagelin was, I think he's from a Swedish family, born in Russia in the late 1890s. And in the 1930s, Boris became great friends with a guy named William Friedman, who was one of the founding fathers of what's going to become the National Security Agency, the NSA. These two guys like each other, genuinely. They're great friends. There's a tremendous amount of correspondence between the two. Their families stay with each other when they're together. And in the early 1950s, they have this very sort of meaningful lunch at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., probably over 3 or 4 martinis. And William Friedman and Boris Hagelin work out an agreement through which Crypto AG, this Swiss company, won't sell its high-quality encryption machines to the Soviet Union or to the Chinese. And, very cleverly, the NSA, and eventually the CIA, they don't put a backdoor in these encryption machines to allow the Americans to sort of read their mail. They very cleverly make the encryption slightly less complicated to decrypt, unbeknownst to the end consumer, and in some cases write up different user manuals. So if you're selling it to the Syrians or the Pakistanis, they get an instruction manual written by the NSA that you think you're running the encryption machine perfectly fine, surprise, you're not. And over the course of this partnership, of course, these two guys get older, and to work out the succession plan, what ends up happening is the Central Intelligence Agency, in collaboration with West German intelligence, the BND, buy Crypto AG through a series of cutouts in Liechtenstein. And throughout the rest of the Cold War, this partnership, this company that's owned by the CIA effectively, is going to end up selling encryption machines to about 130 countries. Syria, Pakistan, Italy, Greece, Argentina, all over the place. And at one point, at kind of the high point of this partnership in the 1980s, fully 40% of the traffic that the NSA and the CIA are decrypting globally is coming off of these machines. So tens of thousands, if not more, of sort of diplomatic cables, conversations that the Syrians or the Pakistanis or the Egyptians think
so they were sold to everyone.
They were sold to everyone.
Amazing.
Sold to everyone. And what's wild is that this partnership continued. The Germans eventually get out in the 1990s. This partnership continues until 2018.
Amazing.
Until 2018. So it is, I think, one of the least well-known and yet most impactful intelligence operations that the agency ever ran.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, Andrei, over to you. You've got two agencies to cover. You've got the Russians and you've got the Ukrainians, which are much less well known, but also fascinating. So over to you, your turn.
So I will try to tell a story which actually tells a story of two operations conducted by these two, by the intelligence agencies of these two countries. So in the early 2024, last year, a young Russian man, 20 years old, was in Spain enjoying his life, and he was shot in a garage by Russian assassins. Not only was he shot, but his assassination was conducted in a very brutal way. His body was driven over by a car several times. It was also a very spectacular assassination because a few months before, Russian military intelligence guys went on television, on Russian television, and said publicly that we're going to kill this guy. So this guy was a former Russian pilot of a helicopter who was in touch with Ukrainian intelligence when the war started in 2022. The conversation with him took almost 6 months, and the operation of his defection, the planning of this defection took almost 6 months. And finally, he flew his helicopter to the Ukrainian side. His two other members of his crew didn't know, were not aware that he's going to defect, so they were killed. So it was a very brutal operation from the Ukrainian side. But the Ukrainians said that we got our guy, we promised and we're going to pay him, as far as I remember, 500,000 euros. And we're going to help him to relocate wherever he wants to live. And he chose Spain. So why this operation is so important to understand what is going on with the Russian intelligence and also with the Ukrainian intelligence agencies. Of course, it was not the first assassination, and we all know that Russian agents, they killed people, including this country. But this one was different. This one was different because it was meant to be, and on several levels. First, it was meant to be a message to the Ukrainians that, guys, you can get our people to defect, but you cannot protect them. It was also a message to the Russian political immigrant community. You cannot feel safe. We have people, and we know how to use these people in Europe to get to you. And the Russian community in Spain was, in fact, part of the operation. It was also a new sign of a new kind of cooperation between different Russian intelligence agencies, because not only the military intelligence was involved, but also the FSB people and some veterans of the KGB were involved in preparation of the operation. It also tells us a story about, not only about how brutal the Russian agency is, but also about some anxieties and vulnerabilities of the agency. Because the way the agency responded to just one defection is very important. The Russian agency believe still in the shadow of a very traumatic history of the Second World War, when Red Army lost thousands and thousands of soldiers who defected to the Germans, despite everything horrible what the Germans did on the Russian soil. Because the system was so horrible and people just tried to find a way to defect. Also, Russian agencies produced a disproportionate, and Soviet agencies before, produced a disproportionate number of defections over the last century. And actually, it's not a coincidence that in one of the founding documents of the CIA, there was a special clause that the president led us to take 200 defectors every year, because they expected Soviet intelligence operatives and Soviet military to defect in big numbers, because they remembered what it was like during the Second World War. And it was always like that. When the war in Afghanistan started, the CIA and the British agencies expected Russian soldiers to defect in big numbers. It never happened, actually. They got only 16 people who defected to the West, first to Mujahideen, and finally made it to the West. But for the Soviet agencies back then, and for the Russian agencies now, it is extremely important to send this message that you cannot defect from our country, because it is about fragility of the regime they believe in. They really believe that at some point, if we get a really big war, all of a sudden people would start defecting. And that is why they are so brutal at responding to such operations.
Thank you. Jake, over to you. Now, you've got a lot of choices, Jake.
Yeah, well,
with Israeli intelligence coups have just been extraordinary. So I wonder what you're going to choose.
Well, thank you for having me. And first of all, if everyone's wondering what this strange wire is at the bottom of my shirt, it's only a microphone. But yeah, I mean, in a way, I've got the easiest brief talking about the Mossad because it lends itself to stories, being probably the most daring and audacious and risk-taking of the global intelligence agencies. And a lot of this stuff is fresh in my mind because I've been spending quite a lot of time recently with Yossi Cohen, who was the prominent director of the Mossad until a couple of years ago, because I interviewed him for my podcast, which is called The Brink. So if you want to hear from the horse's mouth, you can listen to that. But God, what to choose from? I mean, I suppose the thing that's most topmost in people's mind is the pager operation, the beeper operation. We talked a little bit about that. It originated with a 30-year-old female Mossad, junior Mossad operative who had the idea. In typical Israeli style, her concept was kicked up and people actually got behind it and took it seriously, regardless of the fact that she was quite junior. This is very Israeli. He revealed to me in this conversation that we had that this was not a new idea for the Mossad. They'd used it in the Lebanon war as well, tampering with devices used by the enemy, which was interesting. But he is prominent because he presided over probably the biggest, most consequential intelligence coup that Mossad has done in recent years, which was in 2018, in January. So it was a freezing cold night. He said to me that freezing cold nights are always the best to do operations on because people are at home and aren't really concentrating and just don't want to be out in the weather. He was in Tel Aviv in the operations room watching through a feed what was happening on the ground in Tehran. And a team of operatives entered the compound where they were going to operate, saw that there were 3 cars parked there rather than 2, pulled out, radioed back, what should we do? No, it's okay, carry on. They went on, went back in, regardless of the 3 cars rather than 2, went into the warehouse, where of course the Iranian nuclear, now we call it the nuclear archive, but he was very keen to point out that it wasn't at the time an archive, it was their intelligence repository, up to date, of their entire nuclear program was stored in safes, not just in safes, but in safes, within things and within other things. And they spent 6 hours working to break in to these safes, which was like he described it as like Ocean's 11. They didn't use explosives, but they used some other technology which caused the doors to explode outwards from the safes, got the stuff, thousands upon thousands of documents and CDs, photographed it, and fed it back live to experts in Tel Aviv who said to them, get that, don't get that, that's not worth it, translating it, analyzing it in real time to see what was worth taking and what wasn't. In the end, they took pretty much the whole thing, transported it out of the country. But as soon as they left that warehouse, as he put it, 10,000 policemen, 10,000 policemen were on their tail, and all of them separately melted away into nowhere. And I mention that because it was that exposed that Iran's secret nuclear program was continuing despite negotiations with the West, and that later on led Trump to withdraw from the nuclear deal, which was, again, of historical consequences. Now, just as a final coda to this, one of the things that came out very strongly from that Iranian, now we call it the nuclear archive, all the CD-ROMs and all the documentation, was a particular figure called Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. His fingerprints, as Yossi put it, was all over that information. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh has subsequently become known as the father of the Iranian nuclear project, but at the time, his significance wasn't fully understood or known. And this led to the formulation of an audacious assassination plot, which took place in 2020, and which I actually, if you don't mind me saying so, Sebag, it is not obnoxious to mention this, had the privilege of breaking this story to the world about how this was done. Which
I'm all for you boasting about this, so please carry on.
These are the times we live in. These are the times we live in. Oh yeah, buy my book as well. Anyway, and this operation was very, just to finish off, was fascinating because again took place in the wintertime in November 2020, and this was the Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was driving with a team of bodyguards in a car in front, in a car behind, in the car. Beside him was his wife. He insisted on driving himself at the wheel. At that time, Mossad was so close to him that they knew not only what aftershave he was wearing, but they smelt it. That was how it was described to me. And they knew his every move. They knew where he was going. They knew his routine. And as he passed around a corner, various shots, I forget the exact number of shots, were fired, and he was killed. He was hit through the windscreen, staggered out, was then hit again, died in his wife's arms. His wife wasn't hit. Then there was an explosion just off stage, as it were. And it turned out, as I revealed, that the way in which this mysterious killing was taking place, nobody was caught, there was no evidence that was left at the scene, was via a pickup truck in which there was concealed an automatic weapon that weighed about a ton, that was operated remotely via satellite from Tel Aviv. And they had a sharpshooter, a sniper, who was operating this from Tel Aviv. So he was a sniper, but he was looking at it virtually. And as Fakhrizadeh came around the corner, operated this gun, it shot him precisely, and then the pickup in which the gun was concealed auto-destructed or blew up. And the reason why this was done this way was to maximize the precision so that no civilian target, not even any bodyguard, would be hit by this very precise assassination. It was carried out by a team of around 20 operatives. I got that figure because the source for the story, who I was talking to, I said, can you tell me how big was the team? I said, oh no, I can't tell you that. Okay, well, was it more than 20? No, not more than 20. More than 5? Oh yeah, more than 5. Okay, about 20? Yeah, about 20. So it was about 20. About 20 people, Israelis, Iranian nationals and Israelis on the ground, put this plan together, carried it out on the ground with visual contact and so on, and then again melted into nothing and disappeared. And as a final detail that's quite interesting is that 1-ton weapon that was installed within that pickup truck was smuggled in piece by piece across various borders of Iran over a period of time and was then constructed in Iran to carry out that operation.
Well done, great storytelling. And I wonder, we're going to come to you, Gordon, right now, but it'd be interesting to see if people use that story in fiction soon, David.
Yeah.
Whose next book is called The Persian, in case you're wondering. So I mean, we can talk about that in a minute. But Gordon, you have a slightly less glamorous world of British intelligence.
You're saying less glamorous
less
than
glamorous,
this? The world of slow horses, are you
yes,
suggesting?
Exactly,
Rather Gary Oldman.
But you know, maybe if we'll start with Britain, because you can also talk about China.
I'll try and do MI6. I'll try and do 30 years of success, failure, and recovery when it comes to Russia in 3 minutes.
Okay.
With one story
There's
about
a
MI6.
challenge.
There's a challenge.
Okay, very good. Go.
So go back 1992. 70-year-old man who looks like a tramp walks up to the British Embassy in Vilnius, Lithuania, asking to speak to someone from the British Secret Services. He's already tried the Americans, and the CIA have turned him down. They didn't spot that he was useful. There's a British diplomat there, a woman, not a spy, who recognises he's interesting, and she offers him a cup of tea. And in return for a cup of tea, he gives her the secrets to the world. Because it turns out he is the former archivist of the KGB, who has spent 12 years copying down every single secret he can find from the archives of the KGB. The success comes because MI6 are going to realise he's the real deal, and they're going to get him out, not just him, but his wife, and his son, who's in a wheelchair, and his very elderly mother-in-law. And neither the son or the mother-in-law know they're being got out by MI6 in an operation which is half le carré and half slow horses. It's definitely got an element of both. That's a great success. 1999, they're going to publish a book called The Mitrokhin Archive about Vasily Mitrokhin, which has many of these secrets in it. But here comes the failure. That book was designed to warn people about what Russian intelligence and the KGB had done. 1999, everyone thinks the Cold War's over, including MI6, including the British government, including most of the public. Everyone thinks the KGB's dead. That same month, new prime minister in Russia, Vladimir Putin, former KGB man. KGB was not dead. It would take years for people to understand that the past had not gone, but there was a continuity that existed. The beast that Mitrokhin in his own mind had been fighting and trying to slay had not died. We'd see things like the murder of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium. You'd see the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal with nerve agent in Salisbury, which all suggested this. And yet it would take us many years to understand what Mitrokhin, this archivist, could see, which is the continuity between the past and the present. The recovery comes because I think late in the day, MI6 have understood, again, the risk from, if you like, what they now call state threats, China, Russia, amongst others, Iran also on the list. And I think one of the successes was in the lead up to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, when MI6, along with the CIA and others, gained absolutely critical intelligence that the invasion was coming. Didn't stop the invasion, but by using it and deploying it in public in a way that we'd not seen before, they were able to disrupt Putin's ability to shape the narrative about what was going on, to sow confusion about the war, and so, in turn, to be able to bolster Ukraine and an alliance to try and fight him. And we've seen the pushback since on Russian intelligence. But I think it's a story of success, failure, and then recovery for MI6, and not a simple narrative of success.
Andrei, most people point to the leak of that, the warning of Putin's intentions to invade Ukraine as a rare success of Western intelligence and the CIA in particular. What was the reaction to the fact that that huge secret, which was at the time held by a very small group of the entourage of Putin, what was the effect of that on the upper echelons of Russian power and the FSB?
Well, I think first of all we need to remember that things changed roughly around 2016 after the Russian interference in the US election, and at that moment, while we were getting more and more information about Russian operations in public, that was a time when the British and American intelligence and some European agencies started leaking lots of information, trying to, it was called naming and shaming policy. So if you can name all these guys, maybe, just maybe, it would slow down the Russian operations. And to some extent it worked. Maybe it worked for a year. But unfortunately, Russian agencies are extremely resourceful. So what they did, and that was the reaction to this naming and shaming policy, and specifically to the scandal with Skripal, was to actually send a message to the Western agencies that, look, we're going to use other kinds of people. We're going to use people who are not professionally trained. We're going to use proxies. We're going to recruit people for on-off jobs. We're going to use criminals. We're going to use extensively social media to recruit people in your countries. We're going to use people of different nationalities. And the war, when the war started in 2022 as a big war, of course, it was seen as a big humiliation for two Russian agencies, but they soon recovered because we were already prepared for this new environment of publicity. And in a way, they believed that being sloppy, it's not a big problem anymore, because you are sending the signal to the Western governments that you have so many people ready to go to the West to do something really horrible that this naming and shaming policy would not stop us. And unfortunately, it's still the case. The most recent scandal in the UK with all these trials, we have people who are not professional Russian James Bonds. These are people who are really poorly prepared. But there's so many of them that the number presents a problem.
That's so fascinating. David, how do the Western agencies cope with this flood of almost comical amateurs who all seem to sort of base themselves on Rambo or on Western films, and yet, if one of them got through, they could do an enormous amount of damage. How do Western agencies, and I'm going to ask you this too, Israel isn't facing this particular problem, but has many other problems. But how are the Western agencies going to solve or face this problem?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, and it's one that the sort of traditional tools that intelligence agencies have used, to manage it over the years, I think they're weaker now. I mean, you take the example of, look at, for example, if you have essentially people who are not intelligence officers, they're not diplomats, right? And you sort of subcontract aspects of the intelligence work, and it could be attempting to kill somebody all the way to just collecting information, right? If you subcontract that out to people who are not on anyone's radar, what can you do? I mean, you're going to be reactive as opposed to preventative, even with all of the sort of analytic and surveillance tools that we have. If you go to people who are under commercial cover or just fully subcontracting or mercenaries, you can't stop it. I mean, I think the expectation that you won't have intelligence failures in that regard is a flawed one.
Well, I mean, the great case recently was about these Bulgarians who were running a kind of spy ring out of a bed and breakfast in Great Yarmouth.
It was kind of faulty towers.
It was faulty towers.
With assassinations.
Yeah, faulty towers and stroke slow
assassinations.
horses.
Yeah.
It was not the most glamorous group. One of them, I think, was a beautician in Ealing.
Nothing wrong
with beauticians in Ealing, but it's not your classic spy cover.
No.
And the boss of them called them his minions, and they had like a minion toy spy camera. I mean, there's an element of it which is absurd and comic, and yet they were carrying out surveillance on Russian journalists and Bulgarian journalists exiled in the UK. They were carrying out surveillance. They were following them on planes. They were following them around Europe. That's material that could be used to track them down, to harass them, or to kill them. So you've got this mix of absurdity. That's why it is a bit like Soho. You've got the mix of seriousness and absurdity at the same time, and that's the kind of weird bit of modern intelligence.
How did they find the Bulgarian beautician and his minions?
Well, I think it was. I think they were tracked in various places as having been spotted, including around Europe. But we don't know the exact reason. But it's one of the advantages they've got now is that they've got new legislation in the UK, the National Security Act, which means for the first time you can prosecute people for these kind of offences. In the past, you actually couldn't prosecute someone for working for a foreign spy service in the UK.
David, just to sort of move on to a wider panorama here. 100 years ago, intelligence agencies were about sort of 27 people living in a small kind of dusty office in each of these countries. Now they are massive bureaucracies, especially in Russia and America and China. In America, we're all slightly alarmed by the Trump attitude to the intelligence services. He seems to regard them as a hostile deep state. What is happening to the CIA? How good or bad is Tulsi Gabbard? And how damaged is the CIA going to be by this?
And before I answer that, just one thing to add on the sort of amateurs point. I think it made me think of, there was a story, this is maybe 5 to 10 years ago, of the Iranians used, I believe, someone who was working with one of the Mexican cartels, and then there was a Houston-based used car salesman who I think was of Iranian descent, and they got very close actually to trying to blow up the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. at a restaurant in Washington, D.C. That was only foiled because a DEA agent got wind of the plot. So again, no one's an intelligence officer in that chain. No. It's just people who were recruited, in some cases digitally, to do this kind of work.
But it's astonishing then, isn't it, that they haven't yet. I mean, obviously, the yet is doing a lot of work in that sentence. But on
the American front.
Go on.
So I think there's a lot of noise on this point, and so it's helpful to break it down into probably 2 categories to think about. One is, to what degree has the intelligence, and it could be the CIA or it could be the NSA or any of the other 16 alphabet soup intelligence agencies that we have, to what extent has the collection or the analysis been twisted for political aims, right? And then the second piece is, to what degree have the personnel changes been made for political reasons? Has there been a purge, or have select individuals been pushed out for sort of naked politics, right? So those are kind of the 2 things that I was looking at when Trump 2.0 takes over. Because obviously he's said some fairly extreme things about the deep state, the CIA, and I think there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty floating around about his intentions. And I think the answer on both of those counts is sort of kind of, but not to the extent that Trump's detractors have suggested it's the case. And so if you take like the politicization point, right, there have been cases under this administration where I think from the outside looking in, you can say, oh, there was a sort of attempt to politicize intelligence on the COVID lab leak, on the connection between Tren de Aragua, this gang, and the Venezuelan government. The Trump administration was trying to fuse those 2 entities together so they could use the Alien Enemies Act to sort of accelerate deportations from the US. The intelligence that the CIA and the intelligence community was providing indicated there was not a sort of command and control relationship between those 2 organizations. And as a result, 2 officials on our National Intelligence Council, so 2 of the most senior analysts in the community, were effectively fired for standing their ground, right? And so on the politicization point, I think you can draw examples of it. The problem with politicization in the intelligence world is oftentimes the symptoms are things that you don't see, right? It's the intelligence that's not collected or not disseminated because it's going to politically aggravate its consumers, or the analysis that's not written because you don't want to, piss off the White House. So there's a lot of, it's a squishy topic, but you can, I think, see some examples of this. On the personnel side, there have been, I was worried that there was going to be an effort to look inside the CIA or other agencies and sort of come up with a list of people who are on side. I think we've seen some of that at the FBI.
Yeah.
I think that there have been instances at the NSA and at the CIA of people getting lumered, as we call it. Yeah. And so Laura Loomer goes and talks to the president, and then senior officials at the NSA are dismissed, or senior officials at the National Security Council are dismissed. I think there was an outgoing COS chief of station London who was coming here who got lumered, and he was his candidacy was pulled back. So it's happening, but it's not happening in the kind of systematic way that I think was a worst case scenario. So it's a bit of a complicated answer, but I think those 2 areas are ones to continue to watch, because effectively, for the agency or the intelligence community to work, its value is that it creates an information advantage for us, right? And to do that, you need it to be relatively apolitical, and the more politicized it gets, the less effective it is at that job, and it turns into more of a political arm as opposed to something that actually delivers real national security value to the president and others. So that's what I'm watching.
Well, that brings us on to Israel, because strange mixture of, October 7th, one of the greatest intelligence failures, equaled only by the 1973 Yom Kippur War and Barbarossa in 41. And so you've got one agency that's reputation is sky high, and one Sebag, Shin Bet, the sort of MI5 of Israel, which really was responsible for Gaza. How is the fallout going to be? How politicized were those agencies? And have they cured themselves of the flaws that caused this major disaster?
Well, the inquiry hasn't happened, hasn't been announced yet, and it's obviously a heavily politicized affair. A lot of the main players involved, who were decision makers at the time of October the 7th, have spent a lot of capital trying to distance themselves in different ways from that. It's important to recognize, people might not be aware, that there are these two main Israeli intelligence agencies, the Mossad, which is like our MI6, and the Shin Bet, which is nicknamed the Sebag, which is the MI5, the domestic security services. And Gaza ended up falling between two stools in some way, because Gaza used to be occupied by Israel until 2005. At that point, under Ariel Sharon, Israel withdrew unilaterally in an attempt for peace. Now, his strategy at the time was, next we're going to withdraw from the West Bank without any deal, give them to the Palestinians, and then no one can blame us anymore. That was the strategy. And look how that worked out. But pulled out from Gaza in 2005. And Gaza, when it was under occupation by the Israelis, of course, had the domestic security services, the Sebag, the MI5, in charge. Because there were Israeli settlements there were Israeli soldiers there, they were running sources for face-to-face meetings in Gaza in the same way as you would on the West Bank or elsewhere. But once Israel pulled out, even taking the Jewish bodies out of the Jewish cemeteries in Gaza, pulling everybody out, with great controversy at the time. But then the intelligence responsibility for Gaza was not handed over to Mossad as a foreign overseas agency. It remained with the Shin Bet, the Sebag. And their expertise, of course, is domestic security, so it's difficult for them to operate, as it were, overseas. Of course, it's not overseas, it's only over one border, but it was now a foreign place, to all intents and purposes. There were no Israelis operating there. And Mossad did make at least one serious attempt to argue that it should be given responsibility over Gaza, because it was worried about the quality of intelligence coming out of Gaza as Hamas became entrenched, as the tunnels were being built, as $1 billion of Qatari money was filtered into the strip, and it was turned into this hellscape of a terror enclave. Mossad was worried about that, but in the kind of petty NIMBYism of Israeli factional politics, the decision to keep it with Shin Bet was enforced really by special interest groups within the security establishment, not by the Prime Minister's best judgment. And by all accounts, the establishment who were responsible for Gaza had become rather insulated from outsiders. Mossad by nature is exposed to international affairs, is exposed to many different cultures, leaders, ways of seeing things. Their way of thinking is necessarily agile, responsive, quick, emphasis on improvisation, on speaking many languages, on understanding the mentality of the enemy. And while the Shin Bet has elements of that, the military and security establishment in charge of Gaza tended to resemble more of a kind of close-knit family. They all socialized together. They were a bit of an echo chamber. They looked after each other. They covered each other's backs. Whereas the Mossad was a lot more professional, as in the leader of the Mossad didn't have personal relationships, friendships with his subordinates and so on. So I think that this all contributed towards the disaster of October the 7th. And one thing that we can be certain of is that the Israelis are very quick at learning lessons. It's interesting that the Israeli left on a political level hasn't existed since it was in power in the 90s, tried the Oslo Accords, and that led to the Second Intifada. Since then, the Israeli left has not recovered because the Israelis have learned the lesson that don't work, and we're not going to do that again. And I think that in this case as well, those lessons will be learned very quickly. In fact, a lot of them have been learned, but the inquiry itself, as I say, will lead to a serious political battle as people strive to retain their reputations and distance themselves from that day back.
Well, one of the great lessons of this, of course, is like that human intelligence is still terribly important.
Yeah.
And the Israelis place far too much emphasis on their brilliant machines, which were all disabled. So let me come to you for this, because China, of course, is which you've done a lot of work on. First of all, tell us about Chinese technical intelligence and the latest case.
Yeah, it's been in the news recently.
Yeah.
This case of Parliament. So I think the fact China spies on us should not be a surprise. They spy on us, we spy on them. But I think China is different from Russia, and I think it goes to your opening point about understanding the cultures of different intelligence services. Each country, his intelligence service is a reflection of the priorities, the values, the culture of the leadership of that country. And you can see it in the differences between Russian intelligence, British intelligence, American intelligence, Iranian intelligence, and China, no doubt, is different. So you can see it, for instance, in the extent to which their priorities are different. One of their big priorities is actually dissidence. Their first priority is domestic stability of the Communist Party, preserving its place in power. So what do they want most? Well, they want to know what dissidents overseas are doing, Hong Kongers, for instance, who've come to the UK. They also know domestic stability is driven by economic growth. So they want intellectual property, which is going to drive economic growth. They want business secrets, economic secrets. That's, again, slightly different from other intelligence services. And yes, they also want political information, particularly where it relates to how the UK is going to deal with China. Now, there's been this case, and they'll use a kind of different set of methods to collect that from other countries.
So what's really... Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but about this case, what the hell's going on, really?
So you can look at it two ways, conspiracy or cock-up. Now, that is always the case when something happens, when a kind of case collapses in Britain. I think the problem is, even if it is a cock-up that this case collapses, it reveals the truth about the failure of the British state to know how to deal with China. It does not know how to deal with the kind of complex national security threat that China poses, where it is both the second largest economy in the world, which we've got to trade with, and it's spying on us, and it's hunting for dissidents, and it's stealing economic secrets. This is different from the way it relates, the UK relates to other countries, including Russia, including all these other countries. This is fundamentally different, and trying to get their heads around how do we even talk about that has just been apparently quite difficult for governments, successive governments. It's definitely not a party political point, because the last government failed to understand really how to walk and chew gum, how to have an economic relationship with China and talk about it spying on us and being a security threat. And this government is finding it's the same problem.
Andrei, question, people always want to know this. How involved is President Putin in the assassinations that the Russian intelligence are conducting, operations, illegal programs, and the sort of sabotage operations? How involved? Because we all know that leaders love to be involved in intelligence operations, and many presidents always reveled in their their daily intelligence report. What do we actually know about Putin's involvement, particularly in the assassinations?
Well, first of all, we need to remember that Putin is absolutely unique as a Russian leader. He's the first one who actually came from the KGB. Yes, we had Yuri Andropov, but Andropov was a party appointee. He spent a lot of time as a head of the KGB, but he was not a KGB intelligence operative. Putin is, and that is why for him it's extremely important to be briefed. And my partner Irina Bragan, we are co-author all our books together. We brought the story several years ago when Putin was briefed about a very small operation, and you would think, why the president should be briefed about that? It was about a film, actually, a documentary. A CBS team wanted to make in Russia, in Moscow, and the counterintelligence department of the FSB briefed Putin on a daily basis about everything these journalists were doing, which is absolutely extraordinary. But it means that Putin wants to be briefed about minutiae of these kind of operations. What happened after 2016, that immediately after the annexation of Crimea, but also after some problems he faced with in the country politically, he started with micromanaging of intelligence operations. And lots of people inside of the agency started telling us that there is no room for any maneuver or any kind of things you can do independently. You need to tell everything to the boss. And that is why, to be honest, I believe that in cases like assassinations, especially on the Western soil, because it's so sensitive and so important for Putin, he is briefed about these operations and he gives a go.
Interesting. Interesting. I think we've got to ask some questions. So we've got lots more we could discuss, but if there aren't any questions, there's lots more to talk about. But wait till we've got, everyone think of questions, because there's so much to ask, and we've got a brilliant team here to ask. So if everyone can get microphones, please.
Thank you. Fascinating debate. I'd like to take the panel back to the 7th of October, please. President Putin's birthday. In my view, there's no doubt that the 7th of October deflected the world's attention from the war in Ukraine. And the question is there any evidence that the Russian president or Russia are implicated in the war of the 7th of October?
I think that's a question for Andrei.
Okay. I'm not an insider. I was not in the room with Putin that day, but I think, to be honest, I'm slightly skeptical that he was in the know for several reasons. One is that for Russian intelligence agencies, it was extremely important, starting with probably already in 2000, to build really good relations with Israeli intelligence agencies. It started with Sharon, as far as we remember, because the idea back then was we're all in this business together, fighting counter-terrorists, and we can share some experiences. And remember that before 2022, Russian internet censorship system relied heavily on Israeli technologies. So it was not in Putin's interest to actually jeopardize this relationship. Basically for nothing. Because do we really get distracted from the war in Ukraine? I don't think so.
Thank you. Okay, next one.
Simon, could I just ask the panel?
Yeah.
We've seen the pager operation. We've seen the Ukrainian drone operation with the trucks driving and the drones striking deep into Russian air bases and destroying strike aircraft. What role does immediate publicizing of successful events play in both the projection into the population of we've got a good intelligence agency operating on our behalf, and also in the budgetary discussions that all the agencies you are talking about have with their political masters?
Dave?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll speak from the CIA side. I'm not sure, it might be a different story in Israel, but I think there's a pretty significant disconnect between the sort of budgetary conversations and the tactical operational side. I mean, over time, of course, if you have a string of, very well publicized in particular failures, I think that could feed into the budgetary piece of it. But I don't think that at the tactical operational level, there's a whole lot of connection between the budgets and between the ops. And in fact, I mean, if you go back and you look at agency budgets and how they're sort of allocated over time, and bleed that down into the different directorates or the mission centers, like it's a pretty static story, right? The capital allocation inside the CIA or inside any big bureaucracy is really static, which is, by the way, not good. Really dynamic organizations and fast-growing organizations, private or public, tend to move capital around and make bets and plays. Big intel bureaucracies typically don't do that. Of course, it's helpful for the leaders if you have a massive, publicized success and you can get it out through appropriate channels in a way that makes you look good, but I don't see it as having this kind of connection to the sort of financial largesse of the organization, at least from the CIA side.
David, let me ask you something just while somebody's getting the next question ready. We've seen how Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Iran, even democracies like India are now ordering assassinations routinely abroad. We've seen with Trump is now using drones or missiles to blow up supposed drug dealing boats in the Caribbean. Do you hear anything from within the agency or the American organs that there's going to be a turn to assassinations on the American side?
Well, there already has been. So I think there's a great case from maybe 10 years ago. An American citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a member of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and who was carrying an American passport and born in America, but was unreachable by America's police, security services, FBI, and even the CIA in Yemen. There was a decision made during the Obama administration to essentially strip him of his Fourth Amendment rights and to, without any kind of trial, kill him via a drone, right? And so I think the precedent has already been set, frankly, that you could make, if you look at an American citizen, I mean, I'm frankly dealing with a version of this in the novel that I'm working on right now, which is, could you imagine a scenario in which it's legal to render someone against their will or to kill them in the UK, an American who has left the States and is living here? And the answer is it's actually not that hard to imagine at all. The legal groundwork has already been laid for this. And so it's frightening, to be quite honest with you.
It is. Okay, next question. Yeah, please.
Hi, Jake. It's just a quick question for yourself. Mossad's obviously had some incredible success there with Haniya and Nasrallah and their leaders. But at the same time, that's been marred by Israel's inability to tell its story and has really lost the narrative war. So what can intelligence gathering and intelligence operations do in shaping that narrative to help Israel tell its story better?
Good question. I think that this really cuts to the heart of Israeli culture. Israel is probably the only democracy in the world that had an intelligence service before it had a state. In pre-state Palestine, the Jews, who were then Palestinian Jews, they were known as Palestinians, during the World War II, had a covert operation to try to rescue Jews from Eastern Europe and bring them, smuggle them across the Black Sea around to the Mediterranean to break the British blockade. The Brits didn't want refugees coming into Palestine, and to absorb them into Palestine, sometimes at great risk. There's our famous character in Israeli history, Hannah Shemesh, who was a female woman who parachuted behind enemy lines into Eastern Europe in a desperate attempt to help Jews survive. And so really, Israelis, proto-Israelis, were carrying out that kind of operation before the state existed. And of course, the militia of the pre-state Palestine, the Irgun, Lehi, Haganah, were engaged in intelligence operations before a state existed. And so really that sort of desperation of it's us, we are the first and last line of defense for our people is baked into Israeli society before even the state existed. And you see that reflected all the way through. On October the 7th, people who had been out of the military for a long time saw the news, didn't phone up and say, you hear on American films, spy films, you're doing your job, I'm doing my job, as if that's the ultimate goal. And that might be true in America, but in Israel, it's I'm just being me, I'm being a Jew. Whatever my job is, doesn't matter. Something's happened, I'm grabbing my gun, knife, whatever I've got, I'm going to help. People turned up at the army bases in their old uniform without being told to take part in defending their people. And baked into all of that is this sense that if Israel explains itself, the Israeli Jews are not like Jews from the diaspora, where we've grown up with generations in safety, more or less. They are descended from Jews who had nowhere else to go, as they often say, who had nothing but persecution in their DNA, in their knowledge, who'd come from a place where people are going to hate you whatever you do. And if you explain your humanity to them, if you appeal to them to understand your humanity, all you're doing is humiliating yourself. It's like that old line about an anti-Semite only accuses a Jew of theft because he wants to relish seeing him turn out his pockets. You know, tell me how much, tell me again why I should treat you as a human, and I'm going to enjoy that. And so Israelis feel their culture is, we're not going to explain ourselves, you're only going to hate us anyway. We're not going to bother looking for alliances because we won't get any. You know, after October the 7th, we saw that in real time apart from the United States. So we're just going to defend ourselves by ourselves. Again, another Israeli phrase. And so I think that that has led today to a stunning Israeli victory in the shooting war and a stunning Hamas victory in the propaganda war. Hamas were never fighting a shooting war, they were only fighting for the sake of propaganda. That was their goal, which they have almost succeeded in achieving. In terms of how the intelligence services can help to get us out of this hole, us being the free world, Israel, I think that it may lie in negotiating, helping to bring some of the Abraham Accords, further Abraham Accords deals over the line. There's talk at the moment of possible deals in the offing with Saudi Arabia, with Indonesia, even with Syria. If those things were to take place in the coming months, that would go a long way towards rehabilitating Israel's image in the region and perhaps overseas as well. I think the fanatics that we see on our streets who are still marching against a genocide which never existed now, exists even less now. Never existed in the past, exists even less now. The wind will go out of their sails a bit. It's possible that with a new election in Israel next year, some of the reputation of the state will be rehabilitated. But in terms of what the role the intelligence agencies can play, Yossi Cohen, who I mentioned, I interviewed, negotiated the Abraham Accords. That was his baby. And so the intelligence services have a lot to do with those negotiations. If we see those deals, that could really help rehabilitate Israel, I think.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yes. Hi. David and Gordon, love the podcast. My question is, you've talked about what I call the tier 1 agencies, the usual suspects. Who are the tier 2 agencies, the new kids on the block? And what are the Saudis doing, the Indians, maybe even the Brazilians?
Good question.
Yeah,
That's
a good question. Who wants
Thanks.
to answer that, you guys?
It's a good question. I think, there are tier, I think what you can see is certain agencies, including agencies in the Middle East, and some of the smaller states who are becoming much more active and much more global. And it reflects, look at countries like United Arab Emirates, small countries, but actually projecting power internationally and getting very involved. You can also, what you couldn't do in the past, was you can buy intelligence capability now in a way you couldn't in the past. In the old days, you have to build it. You have to have the people, you have to have your own equipment. Now you can go and buy basically what's called signals intelligence. You can buy a big machine which can suck up a lot of data and do a lot of what is going to be the future of intelligence, which will come from AI and modern technology. And you can buy that. And you can see certain countries becoming very, moving into that technological space. And that will give them an intelligence edge, which may match that of any of the kind of traditional big players. So I think there's going to be a kind of leveling, if you like, of the intelligence world to some extent, of those who can keep up in the technological race and those who can't. And if you can't keep up in technology, in AI, your intelligence operatives are going to get spotted. They're going to get spotted on CCTV, they're going to be spotted by their data trails, you're not going to be able to do anything. If you've got the data to find other intelligence operators and do your own operations, you're going to succeed. So it's a different kind of race now, where I think technology is going to be the differentiator.
The only thing I'd add to that, which I think is a tailwind to exactly what you're saying, is that I think politically, as this is maybe more of a Western European answer, but I think you could apply it to pretty much any U.S. intelligence ally. I think you're likely to see more investment in security and intel budgets going forward, because for much of the past, there's been a sharing relationship that's existed with the CIA, with the NSA, where essentially the math is, if you do this with the Brits, right? These are not exact numbers, but if the CIA brings 10 things to the table and the Brits bring 4, 10 plus 4 is more than 10. And so there's this impulse to share. I think we're seeing maybe some of that diminishing, and as a result, you'll see more investment, I think, on the part of sort of, as you say, like kind of tier 2 agencies who have kind of benefited from a lot of American sharing and investment and co-investment, that they're maybe less likely to get that in the future.
Brilliant. That's a good place to stop. And with that, those interesting predictions. Thank you very much, dear audience. And thank you to our brilliant team. And they're all going to sign copies of their brilliant books. I recommend all of them. I think I've read all of them.
Okay.
Yeah, amazing. And I wrote that one, so yeah, that's good.